from Los Angeles. This is the Special Report with Areva Martin.
If you're watching the Special Report, chances are you don't watch Fox News often. But if you've ever watched Fox News, particularly if you've ever watched the Tucker Carlson show, one of the top rated shows on that network. And as we all know, Fox is one of the top rated cable news networks, probably the most watched news network in the country. But Tucker Carlson repeated the Great Replacement Theory over 400 times before the May 14th mass shooting in Buffalo. The New York Times analyzed over 1,100 episodes of Tucker Carlson Tonight and found that he closely mirrored the racist theory and baseless allegations. He mirrored the racist theory and he made baseless allegations that the Democrats and the nation's elites, as he likes to call them, have been intentionally bringing in more obedient voters from third world countries, and that the Democrats and these elites were bringing these voters in to replace the U.S. electorate, which in 2020 was 70% white. It's difficult to understand how that kind of racist rhetoric can be disseminated by a cable news station. But more importantly, we're asking today, how dangerous is that rhetoric, particularly to immigrant populations and to African American communities? My first guest has been writing about Black communities for decades. He is an urban affairs, and he's the urban affairs editor and columnist with the Buffalo News. He's been writing about the Buffalo massacre as well. Good morning and welcome, Rod.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for having me on to talk about this very important topic.
Yeah, so Rod Watson, that's your full name. You've been writing about the Black community. You've been writing about this shooting. Just help us understand how the city is feeling right now in this moment.
I think, first of all, if you go down to the site of the shooting and you see the memorial with the 10 photos of those 10 Black victims, I think your first reaction is just still, even a week, more than a week after, it's just disbelief that there could be so much hatred in this country just based on the color of a person's skin. But then after that, you get angry. You get angry at the fact that the U.S. has failed to live up, to those flowery words it put on paper. All of us are supposed to be created equal. And yet we have a tragedy like this based simply on the color of a person's skin. But then after that, you get angry at the politicians and the media outlets like Fox that have stoked this anger. Because Gendron, I don't think you can blame Gendron alone. I mean, he pulled the trigger, but he had a lot of help in getting to where he was mentally. You talked about Tucker Carlson. The New York Times, I think they called it pretty much flat out said it's the most racist TV show in the history of cable television. That's saying a lot for a major newspaper to say that flat out like that. But to me, it's not just Tucker Carlson. As bad as he is, he's billed as an opinion host. He can say whatever he wants. But if you watch the Fox News, what they call billed as their straight news programs, night after night after night, they have reporters stationed down on the Mexican border, and they're still propagating the same idea of invaders coming in to kill you, rape you, take your jobs, night after night after night. And when that's billed as straight news, I think that can have even a more devastating impact than, an opinion person, because an opinion person, you can say, well, that's just his opinion. I can take it or leave it. The straight news is supposed to be factual. And this drumbeat, night after night after night, of these invaders coming in to take over our country can't help but have a devastating impact in creating situations like we experienced here in Buffalo. At the same time, besides the invasion at the border, there's also this myth of an invasion at the voting booths. And that's why you see this effort to deliberately, state after state after state, to try to make it as hard as possible for people in certain communities, that is Black and Hispanic communities, to actually exercise the right to vote, making it harder and harder because there's this fear that, they're coming and invading our voting booths as well to take over the country. And so you have these restrictions that make it harder and harder. They limit the number of polling places in Black and Hispanic neighborhoods. So you have to stand in line in the hot sun all day long. And then to add insult to injury, nobody can even offer you a bottle of water. You want to make it as hard as possible for us to exercise a constitutional right that's based in the Constitution. Again, these flowery words on paper that we have yet to really live up to. And night after night after night on certain networks, you get this, and it has a devastating impact, as we saw, weekend before last here at Buffalo, with 10 people killed just based on the color of their skin.
Yeah, Roger, right. Sometimes when I'm traveling and I'm just channel surfing, researching, just trying to see what Fox is saying, and you're absolutely correct. It's not just those prime time opinion hosts. It's the daytime news broadcast. It's the evening news broadcast. And I watch the station sometimes for a couple of hours, and I leave thinking, my goodness, for the person that only watches this all day, every day, their opinion, their beliefs are being shaped by so many lies, so many just fabrications, so many mischaracterizations of what's really happening. And oftentimes, those stories that you talked about, those border stories, are happening when there's some other really major thing happening in the news. Maybe it's the the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and you turn on every other news station and they're talking about that, the Russians and the Ukrainians. But Fox is laser focused on perpetuating, this great replacement theory and its many iterations. And that border piece is one way that they do that, to try to show these, outrageous stories of people coming across the borders to, as you said, to do harm to quote unquote good Americans. Good Americans like those that are watching Fox News. You've got to lock your doors. You've got to be worried because these people, these brown people, are
these other people,
these
other people, the sense of otherness that they're creating. And they're either going to do physical harm to you, or they're going to take your job and bring down your standard of living.
Yeah, and what's really so troubling, Rod, is the advertisers. So obviously the opinion hosts can have the opinions that they have, but they only have those because of their ratings. They only have those because of the dollars, as we know in the news business, that advertisers pay to be on that station. So advertisers are willing to, really turn a blind eye to the racist rhetoric, all in the name of, selling detergent or selling whatever it is they're selling. That's also pretty appalling. Should, I have to call out advertisers too.
Yeah, and you raise a good point, because in the sense that the network is just trafficking in hypocrisy as well, because they try to disavow the impact of the words that their hosts and newscasters spew. Yet on the other hand, they're charging advertisers millions of dollars because they know that words have impact. You can't argue it both ways, though they do. And it reminds me of, a few years ago when I tried to watch Fox. I think if you watched them back then, you recall Bill O'Reilly and others night after night were going after the so-called gangster rappers, talking about how that was fueling hate and violence in African-American communities because of the words that they were putting out. And yet now Tucker Carlson and even the straight news reporters are putting out some of those same kinds of damaging words, and yet they want to try to disavow the impact of the words that they're spewing now. And again, it's just that blatant hypocrisy and the devastating and fatal consequences it can have. And in terms of this great replacement theory, who's getting replaced? I mean, if you look at the Bureau of Labor Statistics, in every major profession in the United States, whites are still overrepresented based on their share of the population, and Blacks and Hispanics are underrepresented. So who exactly is getting replaced by who? I mean, we're talking about equity here, but that's not a word you'll ever hear on Fox.
Yeah, no, it's the fear of the browning of the country. And just as an aside, we're going to get back to Buffalo, but you've raised so many good points about rappers. We saw Donald Trump spend so much of his time courting rappers like Kanye and Ice Cube. So this whole notion that, the far right or Fox has disdain for rappers. We know Donald Trump, will embrace anyone that says a kind word about him. So that hypocrisy, as you said.
He will use anyone he can.
I'm going to run out of time with you, Rod, and I got to talk about the city because, how is the city trying to heal? We see these communities, the community coming together. you talked about the memorial that's set up. We know that some members in the community are helping people get to grocery stores outside of that community because that market where the shooting took place is now closed. What else is happening in the city that is really efforts towards trying to heal, even though, closure, I don't even want to use the word closure because I don't know how those families ever get closure, but I've seen the mayor a couple of times on television talking about, how resilient the city is and what efforts are taking place, trying to bring some peace and healing to the city.
Yeah, there have been a lot of efforts in that regard. And, the major sports teams here, major entertainers, they've all been down to the site. They've hung out at the site, meeting with people, handing out food, making donations. There have been, food giveaways and water giveaways, basic supply giveaways around in the neighborhood around the site of the former Tops Market. But really, to me, the question is, what's the long-term change going to be? I think it's really a devastating commentary that, closing one supermarket in an entire neighborhood can have such a devastating impact on that community, on the people in that neighborhood. Whereas when you go out in other neighborhoods, you will see a Tops and a Wegmans, which is our other major supermarket chain. They'll be right across the street from each other in those neighborhoods. So people in other neighborhoods have so many other options, and yet the underdevelopment and disinvestment in communities of color. And Buffalo is one of the nation's poorest cities, and the neighborhood, the district where the Tops Market is located is one of the poorest areas in a poor city. And so I think the real question is, what are we going to do to permanently address these issues now that they've been so exposed by this shooting? And that's what I'm really going to be keeping my eye on as we go forward. The efforts that are being made now are wonderful. A lot of people are stepping up, making donations, giving up not only of their money, but their time, comforting the survivors and their relatives, making sure that they have what they need, as you say, providing transportation to other grocery stores. But the real question is, when something like this happens, how do you develop a community, a Black community here in Buffalo, so that these efforts aren't so critical, that people have other alternatives that they can stand on their own 2 feet? And that's what we really need to focus on going forward if we're really going to bring something positive out of this tragedy.
Rod, I think I heard an expert say that Buffalo is, one of the most segregated cities in the country. And that, the divide,
Yeah.
you just described the racial, not only the racial divide, the economic divide, there's a huge divide. You mentioned, being one of the poorest communities. So do you see this shooting, as horrific as it is, having any impact on changing just even the demographics where people live in a city like Buffalo? It's kind of hard to use the word segregated in 2020, but that's the reality that many cities like Buffalo, I'm from St. Louis, Missouri, a city that still is so incredibly segregated, which is just appalling on so many levels.
Yeah, you're right. Buffalo, year after year, makes that list of top 10 most segregated cities. It moves up and down somewhere in that list, but it's always on that list, and it's always been like that. And there have been efforts to expose the segregation, but there's still those attitudes that have to be broken down. And one of the things I think about a lot when I think about this tragedy, and it may seem a stretch, but if I have a couple of minutes to explain it, this whole idea of critical race theory. I think education is so important. The idea of accurate historical education, because if you look at the statistics, the poverty statistics we talked about, the wealth gap in this country, anywhere from 8 to 10 to 1. Blacks' household median income is only 60% of what whites earn. The unemployment rate, it goes up and down, but no matter what it is, the Black rate will be double the white rate. If you're a white person and you look at those statistics and you say, well, we had the Civil Rights Movement, we had the Fair Housing Act, we had the Voting Rights Act, we had the Civil Rights Act in the 60s. The playing field is level. So if you look at these statistics, there must be something wrong with those people. Again, we get back to that sense of otherness. But you have to put all of that in context. And that's what education is supposed to do, is to put all of that in context. And you don't even have to go back to 400 years ago, even though that's where everything started. If you just go back to the post-World War II era and the post-New Deal era. That's when federal policies were put in place that allowed whites coming out of World War II to benefit disproportionately from the development of the suburbs, to benefit disproportionately from the GI Bill. Even though a lot of those things were neutral on paper, the way they were implemented at the state and local level, whites got a leg up then that blacks never got. And so when you look at what's happening today, the statistics that you see today are a direct result of the advantages that whites were able to accumulate at that time and pass down to their children and grandchildren. And so, when you talk about opening a business, well, the white grandson of those people back in that era, he has that stake to open that business, where a black doesn't have that stake to open that business now because of the way those policies were implemented back then. But we don't teach our kids that. If you're really conspiratorial, you can say it's by design. And that's why, there's so much opposition to teaching accurate history in the schools. If we taught that history, we might be able to change some attitudes today when we think about all these disparities and want to blame the victims when actually they are victims of the society and the way that the system was set up and implemented back during those eras.
Yes, you're so right. And I've been saying on social media and on this show, I hope we see parents flood those school board meetings. The way we saw them flooding those meetings, demanding that critical race theory be taken out of schools, that they flood those meetings demanding that the great replacement theory also be removed from classrooms. And I hope we see parents flood those school board meetings talking about the great replacement theory and the way we saw them flooding talking about critical race theory, because talk about something that's so damaging to our kids. And this statistic that says 1 in 3 Americans believe some version of this great replacement theory is really, really dangerous and really scary when you think about what our kids are being taught. Before I let you go, Rod, I do want to, you said something about the long-term impact of this shooting. I saw the mayor of Buffalo, talk about the need for gun control. We have seen so many mayors, governors stand before cameras after these mass shootings, talking about the need for gun control. And from Sandy Hook to the Parkland school shooting in Florida to now this Tops Market shooting in Buffalo, do you have any expectation or hope that I shouldn't say hope, I think we all hope for, but any expectation that we get to any kind of sensible gun control laws in this country in our lifetimes, really?
Not given the current makeup of the Senate. I mean, given where we are now, you have what I consider 40 Democrats, 50 Republicans, and 2 others. You never know which way they're going to go. Given that makeup, I can't see the Senate doing anything, particularly if they won't even consider eliminating the filibuster. So I don't see any really hope for gun control. One of the things that I did write about recently is the fact that, the gun rights advocates are always saying the only thing that stops a bad guy with a gun is a good guy with a gun. Well, we had a good guy with a gun at the Tops Market, a retired police officer who was a security guard at the market. And he actually got off some shots and actually hit the gunman several times. And yet the gunman was wearing body armor, so that the good guy with the gun had no impact. One thing we could do, and it does because it doesn't have any impact on your ability to own a gun, we could make body armor illegal for anyone except, police officers, security guards, armored car drivers, people who actually need it in their jobs. If we made body armor illegal, someone like this 18-year-old would not feel so invincible in going into a store like that and wreaking havoc like that. That's something that doesn't have anything to do with gun rights. And so it's something that maybe, possibly, Republicans and Democrats, at least enough of them could get behind in order to break that 60 vote threshold in the Senate. We might get something done along those lines. And then there are other things like, just background checks. I mean, even gun owners, vast majority of gun owners support common sense things like background checks. But again, given the makeup of the Senate, I just don't see anything happening along those lines. But maybe we can do something on body armor. That's the only hope I can see right now if I want to try to find a ray of hope in this tragedy.
That's a great point, and I haven't heard anyone talk about that, but you're right. There was a good guy in that store with a gun, and that good guy lost his life as well. So thank you for bringing up that point. Just final question for you. Those of us who are outside of Buffalo that feel the pain and want to be helpful, what can we do to help the community?
Okay, if you go to the Buffalo News website, we have a list of organizations that are trying to help the community that anyone in the country can donate to. That's at buffalonews.com, and you'll find it there. And that would be a great way to help the community and show support for the community. And the other thing we can do is this: no matter where you live, put impact on your politicians and on the businesses that you support, so that they stop supporting networks like Fox News that are spewing out this hatred. I mean, let's face it, we're in the United States, money talks. And as consumers, we have that power if we choose to exercise it. Like you said, that about 1/3 of the country believes in the great replacement theory, but that means 2/3 of us don't. Those 2/3 have to become active and vocal, both with their votes, with their voices, but also with their dollars, where they choose to spend their dollars, who they choose to support.
No, great point, Rod. Thank you so much for joining me this morning. Thank you for giving us that information about how we that live outside of Buffalo can be supportive to the community and obviously to those families. Our heart, our prayers continue to go out. But yes, beyond that, it's action. It's pressing our lawmakers to make those laws that are going to protect communities and definitely